Okay, let's go.
They've gone. I see that. Well, they were here a minute ago. I know. Well, they can't have gone far. Honestly, your powers of deduction astound me sometimes. So what do we do now? Well, why don't we just hang tough here for a sec, make sure they're gone, and then we'll carry on. They can't have gone. Fire! How about my powers of deduction now, huh? Shut up and keep shooting!
In Part 3B of this series, we examined and shot Part 2 of the Annual Qualification, the instructional practices. In this video, we'll shoot Part 3, the classification practices, and discuss marksmanship badges and proficiency pay. This was by far the most important of the 3 parts, for it was this part that would determine the man's status as either a marksman, first, second, or third class shot. Perhaps more importantly, it was these categories which would lead to the earning of proficiency pay over and above his wage. The details of application, snap, and rapid practices have been discussed in previous videos, as well some notes on how I've had to adapt measures in order to simulate some of the finer points of the execution of them. All these aspects will stand for this video as well. Although covered in Part 3A, a review of the scoring standard for the classification practices might be in order. The highest possible score in Part 3 was 185 points. A score of 130 gave the man the status of marksman. Making 105 to 129 points made him a first-class shot. Scoring 50 points in practices 18 to 22, or 70 in the whole of Part 3, made him a second-class shot, while failure to attain this standard relegated him to the lowly status of third-class shot. So join me as I venture into the truly historical and shoot Part 3, the classification practices. My pay depends on it. Practice 18 was a 5-round grouping, lying unsupported from 100 yards at a second-class elementary target.
With 5 rounds, load! At 100, 5 rounds grouping. At the second-class elementary target, fire!
At this point, the man would have had a considerable amount of range time under his belt, even if he'd only been in the army for a couple of years. By the time he got to this practice, I bet it would have seemed like a piece of cake. As most will have noticed by now, I've shot nearly all the practices so far on a mat. Measures such as this were authorized in the form of a ground sheet laid on the ground to protect the man's uniform.
And, yet again, in a massive showing of disappointment, we have 4 rounds, under 2 inches, and the 5th is at 4.5.
I missed the 4-inch category here, and full points, by only 1/2 of an inch. So, as before, I was only able to make 20 points for this practice. Practice 19 was a 5-round snap, lying behind cover from 200 yards at a second-class figure target with fixed bayonet. As in the instructional practices, shooting with bayonets was an integral part, especially at close range. Snap shooting this way is definitely a bit more cumbersome. Moving the rifle quickly into position, and more importantly, settling it into a decent sight picture becomes slightly more difficult with the added weight at the end of the barrel.
So practice 19, 200 yards, 5-round snap with bayonet from behind cover. And, see, I need points because this is obviously the classification practices. And I just missed 3 right there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Total of 12 points here out of 15.
That one miss was a bit disappointing. The fact that my pay may depend on just such a miss was not lost on me. Practice 20 was a 5-round application lying beside cover from 400 yards at a second-class figure target. Unlike practice 5, which was the only other 400-yard practice and was shot on a first-class figure target, this practice was shot at a second-class figure target. 4 foot square versus 6. Presumably because it was thought that having had practice by this point, the man could handle the smaller target at this range. The extra, although by no means complete stability afforded by the cover was definitely appreciated. This was another good example of tactical aspects of battlefield musketry being incorporated into conventional shooting. As with other application practices, 20 seconds per round was the standard.
Practice 20, 5-round slow application from the 400, lying with the side of the rifle rested. Things have opened up quite a bit here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's a total of 15 out of 20.
Not a stunning score, but workable. At this point, I have only to score 3 points to make second class. Practice 21 was a 5-round application kneeling behind cover from 300 yards at a second-class figure target. In scope, this was very close to practice number 3 of the qualifying practices. In this case, the cover was of suitable height to allow the left elbow to rest on the knee, giving extra stability. Pardon the use of the modern table here. One has to do what one has to do.
So practice 21, 5-round slow rate or application from the 300, kneeling behind cover. 1, 2, 3 in the inner, just below the figure down here, and 1, 2 in the black. So that's a total of 17 out of 20. Not a bad score.
The extra support seemed to have helped. 17 points would go a long way towards a good aggregate score. Practice 22 was arguably the most difficult practice in Part 3. It was a 15-round rapid, lying unsupported from 300 yards at a second-class figure target in 1 minute. Building on previous rapid practices, at first 5 rounds, then 10, the 15 rounds here was a natural progression, and was often thought as being the acme of military musketry at the time. It was this practice in particular that McMahon and Monroe at the School of Musketry had championed in their quest to make the British Army the best shooting in the world. This fact was not lost on me as I loaded and awaited the timer. Then again, it was just another practice, one of many that would add up to give me my aggregate score.
Rapid fire!
Of course, when you need things to go smoothly, Murphy steps in to complicate the proceedings. A bunch of heart extractions decided to rear their ugly heads here, and in retrospect I should have given the chamber a bit of a wipe before starting. My bad. As it was, the timer went off just around the last round. Surely I had made it under 60 seconds. Or did I? As it was, just.
So, practice 22. I'd be lying if I didn't tell you I was approaching this target without a slight bit of trepidation, but they're all there, all 15 rounds. As a matter of fact, 12 out of the 15 rounds are all inside the inner, which, according to the scoring scheme for this particular practice only, they're all worth 3 points, whether you hit the bull or the aiming mark or the inner. And the rest of the rings, the magpie and the outer, are worth their normal amounts. So we have 1, 2, 3 in the magpie, and the remainder are grouped here within the inner. So that's a total score out of 45 of 42. I'll take that one to the bank.
With the magpies, I only missed out on 3 points. Definitely happy about that one, especially as it was such a large chunk of the overall score. Practice 23 was a 5-round application lying unsupported from 500 yards at a first-class figure target. Despite its size, the larger 6-foot square first-class target began to look pretty small here.
Practice 23, 5 rounds from 500, lying unsupported. Well, it would seem as though from these longer ranges that I am pushing my groups to the left. So 1, 2, 3, 4, just nick the ring, 5. They're all inners, but it'd be nice if it was a bit further right. It'd score some of these figures. Anyway, that's 15 points.
The wind played a little havoc with the grouping. Had I aimed at the right edge of the inner, perhaps I would have scored 1 or 2 more hits on the figure. 15 points here brought the total to 121. Practice 24 was a 5-round rapid, lying unsupported from 500 yards at a first-class figure target. As with other unsupported rapid practices, starting from the aiming position was an option that was allowed.
Rapid fire!
I managed to finish with some seconds to spare, over and above the 30-second limit. The weather was atrocious for this practice, and lying there in the rain added about 15 pounds to my kit. Wet wool. I had actually forgotten my patching kit after shooting practice 13 at this same range, and so just marked off the hits for that practice with a pen. By the time I went down to film the results from that practice and this one, the snow had started.
Right, practice 23. 5-round rapid in 30 seconds from the lying unsupported at 500 yards. 30 seconds allowed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
16 out of 20 was a decent score though. Practice 25 was a 5-round application lying behind cover from 600 yards at a first-class figure target, which looked remarkably small at that range. I had remembered that the sight setting I had used for practice 14, also at 600 yards, had been quite low, and I bumped it up to approximately 675. Pardon the ambient noise here. There was a raging river not 150 yards away. Having the 20 seconds for each round was definitely a plus for this longer range engagement.
Well, I can safely say that I pulled something out of somewhere dark and deep here, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's practice 25, the final practice of the classification practices. Lying behind cover at 600 yards. So that score is 17 out of 20.
A score of 17 was a great surprise. Excellent conditions, no wind, and the benefit of hindsight in the sight setting paid off well. Well, that and maybe a horseshoe up my ass. There are a couple of important and salient points to take out of this exercise as been exhibited over the last 3 videos. First and foremost is the length, breadth, and scope of the program in general. Extensive preliminary training, 30 yards in miniature range work, followed by 25 practices broken into 3 parts, fired on the conventional range. Secondly was the level of performance exhibited by my shooting in particular throughout the 25 practices. In some practices, I shot poorly. In others, downright awful. The point I'm trying to make here is I didn't need to, say, shoot the pants off the qualification. I simply had to put in a solid effort. As it was, this enabled me to claim the status of marksman. And as we can see through the progression of the practices, I certainly didn't shoot expertly. As mentioned in earlier videos, the shooting of the annual qualification brought with it 2 distinct aspects: status and pay. There was a system of officially approved badges that accompanied various levels of performance, both individual and organizational. They were worn on the left lower sleeve, and perhaps the most common was that granted for wear by all qualified marksmen. Scoring 130 points or more entitled the man to wear a set of crossed rifles on both his full dress and service dress, with obvious differences in quality for each. This, as well as all shooting badges, would be worn until the next year's qualification, when it would have to be shot for again. There was also a group of what were termed good shooting badges, that were all based on comparative scores across the battalion or company rather than the quantitative score of the individual. A badge of crossed rifles and star was awarded to the best shot of each company or squadron. For the best shot of the junior ranks, that is to say corporals and privates in a regiment or battalion, a badge of crossed rifles and star surrounded by a scroll of bay leaves was awarded. For the best shot of the sergeants and lance sergeants in a regiment or battalion, a badge of crossed rifles and crown surrounded by a scroll of bay leaves was awarded. And finally, a badge of crossed rifles and crown was awarded to all the section commanders of the best shooting company. Prior to 1913, these would have been sergeants. But after 1913, these typically would be corporals, after the adoption of the 4-company organization in that year. I must submit a caveat here, as I am not what you might call a badge guy. So, inadvertently, if I've included a badge here that dates from later, say from World War II, I do apologize, and would certainly appreciate a comment below. Of course, there were different colors and styles for the badges depending on the unit and the color of the full dress garment, which would be either scarlet, blue, or rifle green. The second aspect that accompanied the shooting of an annual qualification was that of pay. During this era, most men were eligible for some sort of extra pay over and above their normal wage, depending on their arm or service or trade. This was termed proficiency pay. The award of such pay was tied to performance or qualification. To put things in perspective, an infantryman of a line regiment, i.e. not a guards regiment, was paid $1 a day before stoppages, 12 pence at the time. There were 2 categories of proficiency pay, Class 1 and Class 2. Class 1 proficiency pay was 6 pence, and Class 2 was 3 pence. So, by qualifying for Class 1 proficiency pay, a private soldier augmented his pay by 50%. Good motivation indeed. The criteria for Class 1 proficiency pay was thus. In the infantry, a man had to first be fit and demonstrate ability in route marching, and second, to qualify with the rifle to at least first-class shot. In the cavalry, he had to be a good horseman and shoot to the aforementioned standard. Class 2 proficiency pay was awarded to the men who only made it to second-class shot, with no award being given to the lowly third class. You'll note the only other way to be entitled to Class 1 proficiency pay was to be a qualified signaller. As mentioned previously, when this version of the annual qualification was introduced in 1909, there was a great fear of it being hard, and compared to the version it replaced, it was definitely more taxing. seen here from 1910 or thereabouts, are relatively modest scores. An average of only 99 points at the company level and only one marksman therein. Later in the era, as the men became more comfortable and more skilled, the scores rose. In these examples from 1912 and 13, there is marked improvement. Private Harmon, the best shot in the company here, would have retired wearing the crossed rifles and star of company shot, with a score of 148. Here are the battalion results for the 2nd Battalion, Ox and Bucks Light Infantry from 1913, with a shooting strength of 446. 64 or 14% were marksmen. 193 or 43% were first-class shots. 176 or 39% were second-class shots, with 11 or only 2% third class. To put that into proficiency pay terms, 57% of the battalion qualified for Class 1 pay, with 39% making Class 2. Of course, their physical abilities at route marching notwithstanding here. On a side note, one should remark about the strength of the battalion in this example. With 446 shooters, it was well below half strength on the eve of the Great War. It would have to incorporate over half its wartime strength of just over 1,000 before it left for France in August 1914. Many of the reservists called up for the war had been out of the army for some years. Much of the time between mobilization and deployment was used on the range, getting the reservists up to snuff. It is perhaps interesting that the battalion figures used as an example here were from the 2nd Battalion Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, the same men as pictured here in this photograph at Ypres in 1914. One might consider that these men, with their marksmen's crossed rifles, were some of those included in that 1913 musketry return. Overall, I hope this series of videos has served to illustrate the musketry qualification of 1914, its practices, and the level of skill required to attain a certain degree of proficiency. In the remaining videos of Part 3, we'll discuss and demonstrate the field firing practices, Parts 4, 5, and 6. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below.